Okay. Dear ladies and gentlemen, we start. Please take your places, your seats. Okay. Good afternoon. Let me introduce our honorary lecturer, Gérard Roland, a professor of economics and political science at the University of California, Berkeley. Gérard graduated from the Free University of Brussels in 1988, and his early work was on the political economy of socialist systems. After something like 1990, he became one of the world's most renowned and influential scholars in transition economies and more general in the new development economics. He was among a few economists who already in the 90s explained why so-called Washington consensus was not a good manual for reformers. His papers were published in top journals like Journal of Political Economy, American Economic Review, Quarterly Journal of Economics, and his book, Transition and Economics, Politics, Markets and Firms, was translated in Russian, and it is widely used in advanced economic programs in our universities. Now we get a chance of listening his lecture about evolution of post-communist economic systems. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Victor, for this very nice introduction, and I'm also very glad to be here. So the title of my talk is The Evolution of Post-Communist Economic Systems. And so I'm going to take a little bit of a different stance as was taken in the early 90s, and that will also imply some self-criticism on my part on views that I had at the time. And so I would basically, in this talk, like to propose a new perspective on how to interpret the evolution of post-communist systems. And many of the things I will say may seem obvious to you, and if they seem obvious, that's not going to be a problem. I think that many things have become obvious, but I think it's time also to reinterpret the evolution of post-communist systems. So just to go back in time, if we go back sort of, 25, 30 years ago, when people started observing China's reforms, people thought, well, this Chinese reform, this is not very consistent, it's partial, it's gradual, it's not working very well. And so people thought that when a radical political change happened in Central Europe first and then Eastern Europe afterwards, people thought that with the introduction of democracy, there would be completely free rein to introduce much more comprehensive reforms, and then that the outcome would presumably be much better. This proved actually quite wrong at the time. We observed a big output fall, and actually the growth performance of China was very, very strong. So just here to look at, here you see the pattern of economic evolution after price liberalization. So these are years after price liberalization. You see that China has been, of course, on a very large growth path, and then other countries, including some of the best performers like Poland, Czech Republic, all an output fall first years after the transition, and some countries like Russia had a really deep fall for quite a while, Russia and Ukraine. So that was one of the surprises of transition. Now these surprises of transition led to lots of research to understand both the economic success of China, which was really a puzzle to economists at the time, to understand the output fall in Eastern Europe, and also to understand why the economic performance in the former Soviet Union was much worse than in what are now called the new member states, that is, post-socialist countries that are now part of the European Union. And so people, there was a lot of research on this, and there was a consensus at the time that this stronger and longer output contraction in the former Soviet Union was explained by the difference in the quality of institutions. And then people considered that accession to the European Union played actually an important role in anchoring institutions in Central Europe and new member states. So this was roughly the consensus around the year 2000. And indeed, we see when we look at some measures of institutions, here this is the Polity score. The new member states, they score quite well. Countries from southeastern Europe, not as good, but still quite high. Then you have Eastern Europe, just above 2, which is still partly on the democracy side. Then you have Central Asia and Asia, that includes China and Vietnam, that are clearly in negative territory. Again, if you look at the rule of law, the index of the rule of law, the countries in the new member states of the European Union did much better than, let's say, Russia. So this is Eastern Europe and Central Asia. That includes Belarus and Ukraine, but also Central Asia and China. So now the question that was, so maybe accession played some role, people thought, but one thing that never was explained is why countries that did not have an opportunity, to become a member of the European, why they had bad institutions. And so there was a conference in Budapest where many people who are here at this conference were also. And I wrote a paper, this is 2 years ago, where I emphasized the role of democracy, differences in civil society, and also some differences in values and beliefs on democratization. And I'll come back to that later. But I think all this is much too partial. These are partial explanations. Everything I've said is really just partial explanations. And then I think, now we have sufficient historical perspective to go back. And so I think the best way of understanding transition history is by looking at the evolution of the communist states. And so here I'm sort of working as a political economist because I'm looking at the economy, but also at political institutions. Moreover, today, while we did see, 15 years ago, major differences between the new member states and the non-new EU states, we see that institutions are far from perfect. Corruption is really bad in all former communist countries. Moreover, there are quite clear tendencies towards autocracy, even in Hungary and Poland, and this is something rather new. So here, just very quickly, if you look at Transparency International's index ranking of 2015 for corruption, in red you have the post-communist countries, and they're not in good company. Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan are, next to Libya and Iraq. Tajikistan is behind Congo. Ukraine is between Uganda and Bangladesh. Russia is a little bit better, but not much. Kyrgyzstan is a bit like Iran, etc., and you can go on and on like that. So some other countries are doing better, but it's not really stellar. Anyway, so what I want to do is I want to take a longer historical perspective, and I don't want to focus on particular policies, but I do want to focus on the long-run processes that have been at work. So many people, when commenting on what happened in one particular country, they say, well, the privatization policy was wrong, this policy was wrong, etc. And we have debated about that for a very long time. But I think, if we take a bit longer historical perspective, I think then we can see transition in Central and Eastern Europe less as a process of reform, but more as a process of disintegration of the communist state apparatus. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But then I'm also going to talk about China. And in contrast to what we saw in Central and Eastern Europe, China's evolution is characterized by the conscious replacement of central planning as an economic system by the market economy. And the goal there, which was expressed by the leaders at the time, but people didn't pay enough attention, was this reform was done to keep the Communist Party's control over political power. And so I'm going to, in this talk, basically go over these two interpretations and argue that there are important implications for research. So first of all, let me start with the erosion of the communist state apparatus in Eastern Europe. Under socialism, the Communist Party concentrated all political and economic power in its hands. And in a way, in the very long run, this proved a toxic mix for the communist Soviet leadership. And basically, the idea is that central planning had so many problems, there are so many inefficiencies associated to central planning. You know, managing economy, there were no real balance. You know, the people studying central planning knew this for a very long time. And as economic complexity grew more, that is, there were more and more goods differentiation, more input complexity, more economic links, all this comes with economic development. But the fact that the market was not used as central resource allocation mechanism led gradually to economic stagnation and to gradual erosion of the communist power. This economic stagnation was very well documented, but what I want to emphasize is that this also led to a gradual erosion of the communist power apparatus. And you know, so why is that? I guess many people in this room have still known the system, so they can relate to that, many other people not. But for central planning to work, you know, orders need to be obeyed, at least not challenged. And so you need a strong authority at the center. And if you can't sustain this strong authority, then you're in trouble. Because legitimacy requires that the center be in control, that the center be perceived as having sufficient coordination capacity, having power to execute threats of punishment. People must believe that there's really power to do things and also power to punish people. In reality, the plans were never balanced, but in the early years of central planning, that kind of went along because what mattered mostly was priority coordination. You know, it was steel, coal, heavy industry, etc. And you know, the lack of plans were substituted by campaign-style management, ideological enthusiasm, terror, Stakhanovism. So a combination of these things made the economy even grow quite fast. But as things became more complex, then mobilization was replaced by cynicism. In a situation with chronic shortages, enterprise managers realized gradually that their bargaining power towards the center was actually quite strong because once they were less afraid of the center, they realized that they could ask for more. And so this led to the erosion of the state apparatus. And so a stronger assertion of bargaining power, you know, went together with the simultaneous erosion of the authority. And this erosion of authority happened at different speeds. So in some countries, this erosion went faster. Hungary, Poland, Yugoslavia, I would argue the Soviet Union under Gorbachev. And at that time, these things were interpreted as partial reform towards the market economy. But primarily what it was an increase in the bargaining power of managers towards the center. During the Gorbachev period, I remember how, you know, managers were saying, we're not going to take the plan, you have to, you know, increase our inputs by, you know, 30%, otherwise we don't obey, etc. There was this chaotic state at that time. Now, so, you know, there are differences across countries. In Central Europe, legitimacy was lacking mostly from the start. because there was a Soviet takeover. The legitimacy, was lacking more or less from the start. You had the different uprisings in Poland, Germany, Hungary. You had the events in Czechoslovakia, etc., etc. In the Soviet Union, it was a little bit different. The erosion of power was linked to the increasing economic inefficiencies of central planning. There was strong disillusionment, loss of legitimacy within the elite. That is, people within the elite did not believe in the system anymore. They just saw that the system was not working. And there was also a lack of appetite of top leaders for using terror and the threat of terror to impose power. So, some steps in the erosion of the communist states. The first step that we saw in many countries was the elimination of mandatory planning. The plan quota that you had to fulfill 100%, that was eliminated in Yugoslavia in 1965, in Hungary in 1968, in Poland in the early 80s, and it was quasi-eliminated during the Gorbachev period in the Soviet Union. Step two is an increase in decision-making autonomy of managers, in particular on prices and wages. So managers said, we need more autonomy. That was actually leitmotif during the so-called reform period. And again, in some countries like Hungary and Yugoslavia, it went much further, and managers did have more autonomy on prices and wages. So in East Germany, they managed to keep a cap on this until the bitter end. Also in Czechoslovakia, but again, this varied by country. Now, step three, and here we're already entering the transition topic. Step three is a privatization of assets to managers. That is, managers, they basically eliminated the mandatory plan. They got more autonomy of decision, and then the final step is basically that they get ownership of the assets. First via spontaneous privatization, that is, illegal privatization, but de facto privatization, and then later with the privatization programs through mass privatization, management buyouts, etc., etc. So at the same time, under the communist state, there was also a gradual reduction of the power of the state apparatus towards the civil society and the economic sphere. There was bargaining over the extent of rents achievable outside the state apparatus. In countries like Hungary, it was quite possible to have your own private enterprise. This was tolerated, but this was, of course, not legalized. And again, there was some partial liberalization, in different aspects. Literature, if people remember the Glasnost period, there was very strong, liberalization in different fronts. But as long as the communist system remained in place, the monopoly power of the communist nomenclatura elite remained yet unchallenged. So, and then the transition happened. The transition really started when there was a political overthrow of the elite in power. Now I'm talking about Central and Eastern Europe. This is what happened in 89 and 1990. The political overthrow of the elite in power, or sometimes them just leaving the keys under the carpet, as in Czechoslovakia, after a threshold of weakness of the communist state had been reached. Now, in China, things were very, very different because, here I'm talking about the erosion of power and then market reforms, as a consequence of this erosion of power. But in China, transition started as an economic strategy to strengthen the monopoly power of the Communist Party after the pragmatic realization that central planning was less effective than the market economy. Maybe Deng Xiaoping didn't quite realize that continuing with central planning was going to lead to an erosion of the power, but he certainly had a clear intuition of this. And these days you have to know that the Chinese leaders are obsessed with the fall of communism in Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. They're constantly studying what the Chinese should do to prevent that experience. Now, Deng Xiaoping was also lucky because he had been ousted twice from power, and so he came with a new team of leaders who had been punished under the Cultural Revolution, so they had certain credibility to do new things. Now, coming back to Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, the collapse of the communist states, from the top, the implosion or however you see it, led to a new situation where you had competition between different networks to grab pieces of power of the defunct communist states for their private benefits. And here there are two types of strategies, quite complementary. One strategy is to grab directly power positions within the state apparatus to enrich oneself via corruption, using this power for predatory behavior, asset stripping, or doing it from outside using connections in the state apparatus to grab assets, to get decisions favorable to one's economic interests and economic power. So these were two strategies that were used by many of the people in the former Soviet Union, but also in Central and Eastern Europe, who later were called oligarchs. And so, of course, privatization was the biggest opportunity to use these kind of influence activities to influence the allocation of assets. So people in various countries use their political influence to establish privatization policies that maximize the rents for those receiving control. Free distribution of assets is one example, but there were other examples. I'll talk more concretely about some countries a little bit. Usually, of course, privatization to insiders, but sometimes also to outsiders, like people who were ambitious, like would-be oligarchs who had some connections with the Yeltsin family, or depending on which country, with people who were in power. And so the idea was also to influence the administrative process via corruption to divert outcomes in one's favor. Now, this led to a reciprocal consolidation of economic and political power. People used the market power received from privatization policies or from regulatory capture or any other influence activity, not only to increase one's own wealth, but also one's influence inside the state apparatus, via this double process that I was describing. And so just a few examples. Ukraine, that I've been following quite closely these last few years, is a perfect example of competition between various oligarchic networks. You have people like, Akhmetov, Pinchuk, Kolomoisky, Firtash, Timoshenko, Poroshenko. All these are people who grab pieces of power either regionally or, functionally to become rich and to influence the power, the process for their own enrichment. So when Kuchma was president, Kuchma was seen as a reformer, but when Kuchma was president, nearly all the major privatizations, nearly all, maybe with one exception, were rigged towards oligarchic interests. That is, the rules of the privatization were rigged so that the assets would go to particular interest groups. And so, of course, you've had power shifts between different groups of oligarchs. After the Orange Revolution, some people lost some power. With the Maidan, some other people lost power. But make no mistake, Ukraine is still run by, the state in Ukraine is still conflict between networks of different oligarchs. Now in Russia, there were massive wealth transfers under mass privatization. I could also mention the loans for shares scheme. Here again, there had been a shift in power of oligarchs. You had people who were influential under Yeltsin. Many of those lost favor under Putin. And then, there are also the winners under Putin, including Putin himself and his entourage. There has been a generalization of corporate raiding, that is, people going in an enterprise and using threats of violence to extract property. This has happened, even recently in Crimea, just people going in and saying, "You're out now, I'm the owner," and using machine guns and bodyguards to show that one is serious about this. So in Czech Republic and Slovakia, also we have examples. The nomenclatura benefited also from privatization along with some outside adventurers. There has been corruption in the judiciary and inside the government and its administration to cover up some of this economic predatory behavior. In Poland, one of the best examples is the role of foreign trade centers that were used to siphon away assets by people from the former nomenclatura. And one can go on and on and on, but there are hundreds of those examples. So basically, one has a situation where one has competition between networks, and so nomenclatura insiders, outsiders looking for fast enrichment, networks from former secret police in Russia and Bulgaria, criminal networks taking advantage of the collapse of the communist state. And so this competition between different networks implies lawlessness, collaboration with organized crime, use of power positions within portions of the state, threats and use of violence. And of course, this competition leads to conflicts, but it also leads to deal-making in the shadow of the law. It's not that these people are at war. They know how to bargain with each other. But basically, these are conflicts, to grab parts of the state apparatus. And so obviously, this leads to bad institutions. That was my question in the beginning. How come, we've seen, nearly uniformly bad institutions emerging? And so looking at the perspective of the erosion, the collapse of the communist state, and then the emergence of these new networks from the former nomenclatura, it's obvious that bad institutions should emerge. No internal incentive is there to introduce the rule of law. The implosion of communism then, in a way, explains the organization of the state. One has prevalence of influence networks, clans, generalized corruption, use of direct and indirect power positions for enrichment and siphoning away of resources. I think it's no exaggeration to say that we're in the presence of kleptocratic states where state power is used like an ATM machine. And again, I think this is no exaggeration. That's also the philosophy. That's what people think the state is for. You're ambitious, you want to grab power, and you want to grab power to take away money, just like you take money from an ATM machine. And so this is much more severe than the soft budget constraint phenomenon that Kornai had been talking about when he talked about socialism. This is, has a new, new dimension. Of course, this implies political instability unless one network manages to dominate others. Maybe that's what's been happening in Russia the last few years, that Putin has managed to consolidate so much that there's not that much competition from inside. So one question that is raised is, what is the relationship between the kleptocratic state and democracy? And here I would argue that the relation is ambiguous. So repression is not necessarily in the interest of oligarchs unless their interests are directly at stake or threatened. Of course, kleptocracy is incompatible with the rule of law, but it may completely coexist with corrupt and hollowed out forms of democracy that may not necessarily be highly repressive and that actually go together. If the population is passive enough, then you can have a hollowed out form of democracy. People will continue to enrich themselves, and there's no need to impose ideological terror or anything like that. You just need to get things going. Now, so this is a very dark picture I've been describing. Obviously, there are countervailing effects. And so there are countervailing effects that can explain why the situation, is worse in some countries than others, or not so bad, depending how you see it. And so the first countervailing effect, I would say, is the level of civil society. So Steve Fish actually talked about that this morning. So if you have a low level of civil society development, then of course this leaves the transformation of the state into the kleptocratic state, this network of people grabbing power, unchecked. Because the population then is victim of these exactions, but if it remains relatively passive and fatalistic, people feel that they can just get away with whatever they want. If you have a higher level of society development, that can act as a countervailing power. And actually, I have a paper with Laszlo Brost, who's a Hungarian political scientist, and some other co-authors, showing that indeed there were different levels of civil society development in different countries. So countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia had actually a higher level and stronger maturity of the dissident activity even under communism. Partly, I mean, the repression was strong in all countries, but, in some countries you had the Catholic Church in Poland, or Solidarity, or you had the Chart 77 in Czechoslovakia that had a very high level of political maturity. That was Václav Havel's movement. And so this had an effect on the initial political institutions. So very early on, where civil society was very active, the members of civil society actually participated in the famous roundtables to the way the institutions were formed. And so this led to lower concentration of power in the hands of the executive, to more separation of powers, more inclusive institutions. But you had other countries, mostly in the former Soviet Union, where civil society development was much lower, and where the transition happened mostly as a collapse, as the failed coup of 1991 all of a sudden accelerated things, and civil society was not that developed at that time. There was a strong dissident movement, but not as strong, certainly not strong enough to make the system fall. And so in this kind of situation, these nomenclatura insiders could grab power much more easily. And we've seen also the political institutions of former Soviet Union had all forms of strong concentration of powers in the hands of the executive. Now, Russia, contrary to many other former Soviet Union countries, was more democratic in the 90s, but it still was the case that you had strong presidential institutions. So civil society did play a role here in countervailing the effects of the erosion, of the collapse of the communist state. Here, this is just some figure showing that's a very different level of dissident activity in Central Europe and even in former Yugoslavia relative to the former Soviet Union. Now, countervailing effect number 2 is culture. And what do I mean by culture? These are the values and beliefs of the population about how the world works, how government should be, how the economy should be, etc. And so reaction against a kleptocratic state is not just about the level of activity of civil society, it's also about the values inside society, how people think their society should be organized. Now, here I have to say that in former transition countries, values are actually quite authoritarian compared to Western Europe, and much more in favor of government intervention. These values, we can see this from the World Values Survey or from the research by the EBRD, values are also more nationalist, more favorable of discrimination towards women, homosexuals, ethnic minorities, foreigners, etc. And the interesting thing is that values have not changed that much since the beginning of transition. So here, if you just look at this graph here, you have different indicators of values. So here on the horizontal axis, you have favorable towards economic interventionism. So if you're close to 0, then you want laissez-faire. If you're on the right, then you want more economic interventionism, state ownership, monopolies, etc. On the vertical axis, you have forms of political interventionism, like favorable towards discrimination, favorable towards strong, strong or authoritarian values, looking as government, as law and order, etc. And so if you put these things together, it's quite interesting. So here on the right, you have here in the lower corner, you have the US. This is different years, from 1990 to 2000, 2005. And so the US, has low values for economic interventionism, low values for political interventionism, as you would expect. Here you have EU countries, the EU 15. Political values are roughly the same. somewhat more in favor of economic interventionism. And here you have transition countries. Now, transition countries include also Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, all those other countries. And the values there are not that different, you know, let's say from Hungary and Russia. So they're quite authoritarian. And so you see that there's favoring more economic interventionism and more in favor of political authoritarianism. So these are values inside the population. So that's one interesting fact. The second interesting fact is that if you look at 1990, 94, 99, or 2005, this hasn't changed that much. So many economic changes, institutional change happened during those years, but the values have not changed that much. And you know, and there are authoritarian values. If you look at the current government in Poland or in Hungary, you know, then you know, these values are partly behind that. Countervailing effect number 3, that is EU accession. I already mentioned this in the beginning. The EU accession provided an external check on the formation of kleptocratic states because the EU, however bureaucratic, you know, the process was, you know, different governments received, you know, documents like this of all the laws that they had to adapt, but still there was an external check on what was going on the institutional formation in those countries. And so certainly the incentive to enter the European Union strongly dampened kleptocratic behavior compared to non-accession members. And so we see, again, I don't have the time to talk about it, but the more sort of kleptocratic actions that were taken were early on in the transition process before the accession to the European Union. Once the accession negotiations started to be very serious, then there was a serious dampening of this. Of course, you know, this is limited. This effect was stronger before entry than afterwards. Once the countries became EU members, then they said, okay, now we're in, now we can do what we want. And then you see the autocratic drift in Hungary, left virtually unchecked. You have now the autocratic drift in Poland. We don't know what's going to happen there. Still, compared to the countries that are not members of the European Union, there is still institutional support. And I think one example that really is important here is, for example, Romania, that has a history of corruption. And so the European Union has provided strong support in the last 2 years to fight corruption in Romania, up to the point where the Prime Minister has been indicted in a corruption case, which is something, you know, unimaginable in other countries. So the EU does, you know, play a role as a countervailing effect. Okay, so you have this sort of reinterpretation of transition seen more as the collapse of the state apparatus and as the consequences of, you know, oligarchic networks grabbing power, and I mentioned some countervailing effects. Now, of course, this is very much, you know, conceptual, and many of the facts I mentioned, I'm sure many in the room can bring many other facts to bear. But it has implication on how we think about transition. So implication number 1 is that even though many you know, post-communist countries did not introduce, quote-unquote, the right institutions, the state apparatus inside post-communist countries has been deeply transformed from one where there was communist absolute power monopoly, no question about that, to states where you have bad institutions, but you have mostly kleptocratic turfs of various stability shared by various networks. So, and even when, you know, one dominates, there's just no comparison with the communist state apparatus as existed, you know, before the transition. But implication number 2, and this is probably, you know, a little bit harder, is that reforming post-communist state with failed institution is quite of a different nature than reforming the communist state at the beginning of transition, where the issue was introducing democracy and introducing the market. Now that you have this profoundly transformed state, these kleptocratic states, the challenge is not to have more market. Hosting corrupt vested interests. And this, I think, requires a much deeper and longer term transformation. This is not something that is as easy. It's not something that can be done from above. And here I would like to say, I think what is currently happening in Ukraine is a very good example, and in a way is a very good warning. So you had the Maidan. Civil society, is still quite active in social media, etc., in Ukraine. So people are still 2 years after the Maidan, they're still quite mobilized. One of the reasons for that is that because there's the war. Actually, the war in the Donbass is keeping people mobilized, because every day there are people being buried, and these burials are very open. And so the memory of what's going on is constantly revived. But despite this mobilization, you still have a lot of the oligarchs who are in power, who are trying to change a few things, who are trying to retreat a little bit in the hope that they will be able to seize power. But the truth is that in Ukraine, corruption is still very prevalent, and despite the change of the Maidan, there have not been any deep reforms to oust corruption. And I think this is a warning, because if one day there would be something like the Maidan in Russia, and democratic forces are quite strong in Russia, this change would just be the beginning of the transformation of the state, not the end. So in Ukraine, they realize that they're at the beginning, and they may fail, and if there are some changes in Russia, it's not going to happen overnight. Okay, now let me switch to the Chinese system. In the light of the stagnation of the Soviet Union in the 70s, but mostly because of the chaotic and actually completely lunatic Maoist management of the economy since 1958, Deng Xiaoping thought that the best bet to consolidate the power of the Chinese Communist Party was to introduce the market economy, following the examples of Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. So there was a debate after Mao's death, and so some people were saying we should go back to classical socialism as we had in the 50s. It was working quite well. And Deng said, no, that's not a good idea. Look at Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. There are lots of Chinese over there. They've been economically successful. If we cannot be as successful as them, then the communists are going to lose power in mainland China. So it's existential for us to do as well as Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. And so Deng used the power of the Chinese Communist Party to unleash market forces. This seems very contradictory. So he used the power of the Communist Party to unleash market forces, relying on two main pillars of reforms in China, which was on one hand decentralization, and on the other hand a meritocracy. So this is now the consensus view on what happened in China, but let me say a little bit, because I think China is not well known inside Russia. So essentially what happened is that the fiscal powers were decentralized to the different provinces and even further below, with hard budget constraints. That is that the tax collection was happening from below, but the cadres had lots of power to do things. And then they introduced yardstick competition. So they told to the different leaders, they said, whoever has the highest growth rate will have the faster promotion. And so this led to a frenzy of initiatives, and because they had decentralization, they could take these initiatives to try to promote growth, because the leaders saw that this is my best chance of being promoted. If I want to be one day in the Politburo, in the standing committee, etc., I have to be better than my colleagues in generating growth for my province. So the growth process in China, and as I repeat, again, this is the consensus of people doing research on China, is that thanks to decentralization and meritocracy, the Chinese Communist Party managed to have a miraculous growth in the country. And this growth process eventually reinforced the power of the Communist Party in all spheres, the military, the education, the press, instead of decreasing it. And here again, I have to say that people like me or others, we thought that after the economic reforms, there would be some political reforms, that there would be some political liberalization. But that's not really what happened. And if you see what's going on in China today, you will realize that that's the case. That actually, the stronger China became economically, the stronger became the power of the Communist Party, up to a point where, you know, the power that they have in terms of, you know, personnel control, military, promotion in all spheres of society has become quite strong. Now, the thing is that a very strong private sector has been developing in China. And again, how do they react is by co-opting the private entrepreneurs. Since 2001, private entrepreneurs can become members of the party. And they can get privileges as members of the party because they have privileged connections, so which is good for their business. But at the same time, the party keeps control of the private sector. In every private enterprise in China, there is a Communist Party cell, very often, you know, led by the manager, but not always. So the party is present not just in state-owned enterprise, but also in the private sector, has strict control. Not that they intervene because they're smart people, you know, when they don't need to intervene, they won't intervene, but they are everywhere. So, yes, so as I said, there has been a strengthening of the power. And so, you know, the leaders stated it quite openly at the time. The transition to the market economy was decided really with the goal of preserving and consolidating the power of the Communist Party. And so far, this has been an unmitigated success. So in a way, this seems very paradoxical that, you know, given that the communist ideology is so anti-market, that China's current system is one where you have the Communist Party in power and basically overseeing a very thriving market economy. So growth objectives were using the existing communist institutions, and so the power of the party has increased, and probably right now it's one of the most powerful organizations in world history. You know, of course, the only other strong power I can think of is the Vatican. But as Stalin said, you know, the Vatican doesn't have, you know, how many divisions, the Vatican. CCP has power over a very strong army. And so this reinforcement of the communist state has led to a state structure that is very different from that in Eastern Europe. And even if I look at sort of the, you know, countries where there was never democracy introduced, like, you know, Belarus or, you know, most of the Central Asian countries, the Chinese communist state structure is very different from what you have in those countries. The Communist Party stays very united. They apply very strongly the principle of democratic centralism. They control all the power levels. The state is able to impose hard budget constraint on enterprises. So the idea of using the state as an ATM, that's not what's happening in China. And of course, the censorship, the restrictions on freedom remain quite strong and have even been reinforced in recent years. And I would argue that this is inevitable when leaders have not been elected. Now you say, well, you know, this seems like an explosive mix, a communist party overseeing a very strong market economy. So obviously there are challenges that the CCP has to overcome. One challenge is the fact that they're still using a completely obsolete communist ideology. So they're still saying that the goal is to have communism, that there should, you know, that in the end they're keeping all these slogans. And so people would think, well, this is completely obsolete as an ideology. Why don't they transform this ideology into something nationalist? Why do they cling on to the Marxist-Leninist ideology? And here there's something interesting. So there's actually a very interesting paper by Haifeng Huang called Propaganda as Signaling. And so, and this goes to deep cultural differences about how people view communication and even the content of communication. There was in the Han Dynasty, one of the advisors of the emperor was called Zhao Gao. This is from nearly 2,000 years ago. And at some point, in the court of the emperor, he, so there was the emperor, there were all the advisors of the emperor, etc. And then he brought in a deer in the court, and then he said in front of everybody that this is a horse. And people were a little bit baffled in the beginning, and then the advisors, they said, oh yes, this is a horse, okay? And so this is what's going on in China today. Nobody believes the communist ideology, including the leaders. So this morning somebody was asking, does Putin really believe what he said? And then the answer was yes. The Chinese leaders do not believe in the communist ideology, but they use this as a means of communication. And so people who are able to repeat these things, this is just a signal of loyalty. So this is just a jargon that is being used that's completely empty, but it's a way to communicate loyalty. And so there's a similar paper by a former student of mine, Li Minwu, on the Confucianist etiquette, which was very strong in the court of the emperor, and this played a very similar role. Now, of course, the weakness of this is that if leaders are perceived as weak, the ideology cannot be used to enhance their legitimacy. The ideology is purely used as a loyalty signaling device. And if the leaders are perceived as weak, then there will be strong rivalry to challenge their power. And this is why it's increasingly important for leaders such as Xi to be seen as not weak. And so everything that you can see, a lot of things that you can see can be seen as ways to signal to the country, I'm Xi, I'm not weak, and this is why. Another challenge is the challenge of corruption. Corruption has, with the market economy, has reached quite important amplitude. It's been very strong up to the point that people purchase government and party positions for money. That this is not happening at the higher level, it's not happening at the level of provincial leaders, etc., but at the level of district, etc., you have cases where people who had amassed a lot of money purchased a government or a party position. There is a trade-off between promotion chances and bribe taking. So people who are ambitious, who want to become a future leader, they try to keep away from corruption, taking bribes, etc., because that would be bad for their ambition. But local leaders who know that they're not going to get much promotion, then they say, okay, I'm not going to get much further, and now I take the rents and I take bribes, and there are lots of people offering bribes. There is a danger of private enterprise networks as private enterprise becomes stronger, that they become independent from the party. But as I said, the answer so far has been, one, to co-opt successful entrepreneurs, and two, to have party presence everywhere inside the private enterprises. So Westerners who work in a private enterprise in China, on one hand you have rules of corporate governance, all this in the detail, but in the end, the party chief in the enterprise is consulted, and this is completely contradictory with the corporate governance, but that's the reality, that's how things work. So because corruption is, corruption could potentially completely erode the power of the CCP. So the CCP has a genuine interest in fighting corruption, But of course, this is a bit like, a Sisyphus problem. There's this strong internal tension. On one hand, the communist leaders are supposed to take decisions at a different level to promote growth, to let other people become very rich, but they should behave a little bit like ascetic monks who on one hand make this happen, but who should not, personally show interest towards material wealth, etc. Of course, that creates a problem, and it's difficult to stop this without enough, legal economic incentives. And so there's now this very strong anti-corruption campaign. Some people say the anti-corruption campaign is only against the enemies of Xi, but there is a research, actually research done at Berkeley by some of my students showing that people who are, in Xi's faction are also persecuted on corruption. So corruption is basically everybody is in the same pot. The CCP really wants to fight corruption because they perceive this as an existential danger. Of course, the way this is done right now is likely to dull incentives at the lower level. And so one of the reasons growth in China is probably going to be lower is because of the anti-corruption campaign, which dulls the incentives. Nevertheless, I would argue that the system is quite stable. The main tasks of a power structure, as one would perceive this in political science, are not challenged. On one hand, they have solved the succession problem, which is one of the biggest problems in political systems. There's mandatory retirement at 65 for Central Committee leaders. 68 is the maximum age to be member of the standing committee in the Politburo. And so that means that there's an age interval between 50 and 68 that reduces the number of candidates who can get higher power. So the succession problem since Deng Xiaoping has been running really well. No crisis so far, very predictable. The rules are being followed. The leaders are able to solve the internal informational problems. The top party leaders have always used vertical channels of information where there's reporting duties at all levels of power. And these vertical channels have failed several times in the history of Chinese communism. So the best example is the Great Leap Forward, where famines were taking place, like 20 million people died, but the leaders did not dare to tell Mao that his policy was not working. It took Peng Dehuai, who was the marshal, the chief of the army during the Korean War, to tell Mao openly, this is a catastrophe, it's not working, and so he was very blunt. And Mao did not like it, but still that had to stop the Great Leap Forward. So since then, leaders have learned to rely on alternative source of information. And there is research showing that there is tolerance of local revolts because local revolts give information about what is going on. There is tolerance of whistleblowing. With SARS, that was a good example. So they realized that whistleblowing, social media, there's some censorship, but mostly they try to avoid it because this is a very useful informational device. Finally, taxation and state capacity are not a problem. China is not Zimbabwe or Sudan. The significant state ownership gives direct control over state resources. Moreover, compared to advanced democracies, China's Communist Party has additional instrument of party mobilization. They can mobilize, the party and the population at time if they need to mobilize resources. This is something that is unique to communism in a way, and they can use this in exceptional circumstances. They still have the Leninist organizational form designed to keep party unity. They have the party-government duality, that is that you have the party and government structure at all levels of power. There's some research showing that this is actually useful to dampen revolt. So just to give you an example, the party chief of Chongqing was Bo Xilai. He was ousted, but the mayor of Chongqing, that's the government structure, is a very popular person. So when Bolshoi was ousted, there was no revolt in Chongqing saying, why did you do this? The mayor is still there, and doing good work, people are quite happy, even though their champion in the party was ousted. And so one can argue that the collectivist culture in China is well suited to the existing political institutions. Now, again, to finish, what are the implications of this reconceptualization of Chinese transition? Implication number one is that the success of market reforms in China is not despite the power of the Communist Party, but because of it. The party is behind these reforms. The growth objectives were pursued via meritocratic competition, reinforcement of the power of the party over the economy, over personnel decisions, the army and the media, and power is both the instrument and the goal of the party. Implication number two is that I think there's little hope of gradual political reforms in China in the direction of democratization, separation of powers, or accountability to the people. So China will either continue being a sui generis modern economy under the absolutist rule of the party with some delegation to the government, or be subject of a process of state erosion via corruption, which goes higher up, and once corruption gets at the highest level, then it's, in a way, it's too late. So to conclude, the transition outcomes in Central and Eastern Europe are, in my view, better understood by the dynamics of state erosion rather than by policies. Reforming post-communist kleptocratic states is a very, very different challenge from transition. I would argue a major challenge, one that will take a long time. China made a major institutional innovation, that is introducing a market economy under communist rule. The Chinese Communist Party faces specific survival challenges in the future, but there are few hopes of major political reforms. Thank you very much.
Okay, now we have time for questions and comments, please. Who would like? Please.
I have one question and one comment. So the question is, at least two books characterize the Communist Party of China as an emperor. One book, Organizational Emperor, and another book of Michel Aglaïta as a collective emperor. Do you agree with this characteristic? And the comment. You spoke about democracy, but what kind of democracy? Is it a form of government with elections, or democracy in the sense of John Dewey, which is mode of life, with a mode of exchange of experience? And in this way, the democracy in China may be even stronger than in the West, because they actively use so-called deliberative democracy. For example, such reform of medical care, before it was introduced, a national scale consultation took place. Never in the world this kind of consultation exists. Thank you.
Okay, so on your second one, I take the sort of standard definition of democracy, where the leaders are elected, where you have separation of powers between the executive, legislative, and judiciary branch of government, and I think that's very important. When, for example, when talking about corruption, it's very important that the judiciary, be independent. So, of course, there's a lot of deliberation in China. but the leaders are not democratically elected. And actually, this leads to a difference. And let me just give some example. If Obama is insulted in the US, if people even treat him, being a monkey or, racist insults or just say he's a weak leader, he can be insulted as much as people do, but he has been elected. And having been elected, he has the legitimacy, and this legitimacy makes him strong. And so he is not afraid, and he should not be afraid of anybody expressing, even insults. I mean, you have this recent case of the German humorist insulting Erdogan in very bad taste. And, in the US, I'm sure people have written things like that, and it just doesn't matter. Because you're elected. If you have not been elected, then the logic of power is very different. You cannot appear to be weak, because if you appear to be weak, then because of the competition within the leadership, people will make a bid for power. And so in all autocratic system, in all non-democratic system, the logic of power is such that the existing leader has to appear strong, and that implies censorship, that implies arbitrary decisions, anything that makes the leader feel strong. So my definition of democracy is very, very clear. These are the standard definitions. As to the CCP being an empire, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that if you look at the meritocracy, that existed in the imperial system. You had the system of exams, people passed the exams, and then the successful governors got more promoted. So there is a lot of continuity between the Chinese empire and the current Communist Party. But I would still argue that the Leninist principles of organization, that people know this well in this country, are specific and have created forms of organization that are specific to China these days, and that help to reinforce the unity of the party, which again is something very important in an autocracy, because if you don't appear united, then you don't know what can happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Other questions or comments, please? Please go ahead.
There is some debate on the future of economic growth in China. So my question is, what is your comment on the idea that if China keeps its extractive political institutions, the growth will become slower and slower, and China basically wouldn't be able to sustain long-run economic growth?
Yes, this is at the heart of the fears of the Chinese leaders, and they are obsessed with what happened to the Soviet Union, and they know that before Gorbachev there was the zastoyny period. And so they don't want to go, to reach a point where they have, zastoy. So this is why they're trying to do everything they can. And so their strategy, which I think is a very smart strategy, is to be integrated as much as possible in the world economy. And so for example, the export sector is directly, competitive, so has been working. So there they follow the Asian model of Japan and South Korea. But they're doing more. They're being very active. So for example, the one recent initiative that should be watched, and this is actually relevant for this country, is the new Silk Road initiative. So they have these two new Silk Roads, one by land and one by sea. The idea is to have more infrastructure, and in particular, they want, one aspect, let me talk about that, is to have infrastructure investment across Central Asia. Now, what's in this for the Chinese? The Chinese, they have natural resources, but they lack many natural resources. Just like Japan in the past is still Japan today, they need to have access to natural resources, like oil, etc., etc. So Central Asia is extremely rich in natural resources. Of course, Russia also, but Russia and China have always had a difficult relationship. And the fact that Putin talks about the Chinese model, etc., there's still wide distrusts of China for historical reasons, but then it's Central Asia basically, because Central Asian countries, they just can't talk to each other. You have Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, even within countries you have problems. The Chinese think that by building infrastructure in all those landlocked countries, they can have access to natural resources. They can help those countries becoming richer, and the Central Asia can become a very important center of gravity of the world economy. When just look at the map, you look at possible natural resource that can flow through there. Kazakhstan is a relatively well-run autocracy. I can go on and on about this. Of course, Putin, says he very welcomes that, but there is clearly a challenge. The Chinese don't want to challenge the Russian regime. They're just following their economic interests, so they don't really want trouble with Russia. But this is part of what they do, and so the reason they're doing these investments is that they want to be deeply integrated in the market economy. And so their reasoning is that as long as we can have higher growth than the rest of the world, the party is safe. That's their reasoning. Whether that will happen, that's still another story, but that's their strategy, and they think a lot about that. The Silk Road Initiative, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. There's a lot of thinking that goes into that, and they think long term. They think long term. So now growth is at 6.7. It can, even if it goes at 3%, they're not necessarily lost if the world economy grows at less. But if they're integrated in the world economy, if they still are strong, in investment, in export, etc., they think they're safe. That's their thinking.
Okay, Gérard, let me ask the questions. Ukrainian GDP, PPP per capita was in 1990 20% higher than Belarus one. And in 2014, it was more than 2 times lower. What is your explanation? Is the first question. And the second one, assume that we are living in Russia in 1991. What would be your advice how to conduct reforms?
It's too late, 91 years. 2 years early.
Okay. So on the first one, I think 2 things. One, Belarus seems to be doing really well. I mean, right now it seems to be growing through a phase where it's doing very well, and again, you have to look at it. I think you have to look at these things in the medium run. So there are periods of optimism, pessimism about particular countries. I remember a few years back I had done some work for the BRD, and then basically showing that Slovenia had done the most institutional change on many indicators. And they said, "You're crazy. They just have this bank problem. Slovenia is a mess. Basically it's a basket case, etc., etc." And at times, I remember how Asian countries, with the East Asian crisis, they were all basket cases. So I think there are a lot of things there. So we have to see this more in the long run. Now, Belarus is kind of a stable, stable autocracy. It seems to me. I should know more about that. Ukraine has had very dysfunctional economy since 1991. The subsidization of energy was absolutely, I mean, just enormous distortion. So at least Russia there had done more reforms to correct some of the distortive allocations. But right now there's also the war. The war is clearly having an effect, and Ukraine doesn't have many results to show for. One of the major things people were unhappy about is the corruption, and as I said, the corruption, there's very little that has happened there. So the current mood in Ukraine is rather pessimistic. Coming back to 1991. I actually wrote about this at the time, but so I thought in Russia that especially after the communist power was outlawed, that there should have been a period of constitutional reform. That is, just like the United States chose its constitution after they defeated the British, after the Communist Party being outlawed, there should have been the major emphasis should have been on constitutional reform, and there, people who had been the most active in the dissident movement, etc., should have been more consulted. Instead, they did nothing like that. And I remember I talked to people, including Guy Dower and his team at the time, and they said, we don't need to do these political reforms because we're in power. Okay? But then look what happened, just a bit later. You had the crisis in the parliament, you had the tanks in the parliament, there was a constitutional crisis, and still today there has not been, I think, the necessary institutional change, because having institutional change that go towards having limited executive, to having separation of powers, I think would have helped. This would have helped. So you asked what that's what I argued for in 1991. I know many people disagree with me on this, but that's what still today, I think that's what I would have done.
Thank you so much for your lecture. It looks like kleptocracy is a kind of some special thing about post-communist regimes, and probably it's the huge problem. I wonder about your idea that culture can work as a factor of constraint. Could you talk a little bit more about it? In the way you explained it, it's not just about culture, it's about social vision, shared social vision. So it's also probably about ideology. And are there some correlation, say, between this factor and the time period of communist rule in particular part of the world, or something like this? Thank you.
Yes, so several things. I think culture plays a very important role in the long run. You can introduce democratic institutions in a country, but if the culture if you don't have a culture of an active, civil society of people taking initiatives, then you see differences. The best example is Italy. Northern Italy has had an active civil society, there's a culture of civic cooperation, and in the south there's been more mistrust, etc. And so they have the same formal institutions, but if you look at indicators, there's a big difference. So that's one reason why culture matters. Culture also matters because when people choose the institutions that they want, it's going to correspond more to their worldview. So the worldview where the power of the executive is limited, where there's accountability, this is related to the individualistic culture where people want citizens to have maximum freedom, they want to be equal before the law, they want the law to be the same for everybody, and they understand that people in power can have incentives to abuse their power, so you want to limit their power. That's a little bit the sort of Western individualists, liberal worldview, etc. But that even the social democrats in Europe share. So what I wanted to say, what I wanted to show is that actually in Central and Eastern Europe, the values are more authoritarian. And here, this is not just about communism. I think it's also the case that in most countries, even in Central Europe, they did not have experience of democracy. If you look at Hungary, Czechoslovakia, etc., in those countries, first of all, they were under some empires, and then when they became independent in 1918, they had pretty autocratic tendencies. So the values of the population there is autocratic. So I don't blame, in a way, if I wouldn't, if the population has authoritarian values, then under democracy, authoritarian leaders will be elected. Now, the thing is that if you have a constitutional process before that, you can limit the damage because you can, prevent powers from being accumulated too fast. But there's a limit to that. We see that today in Hungary and Poland, the separation of powers is being curtailed a little bit. So that's important. But now in the long run, if I look at the whole world, not just the post-communist world, so you have on one hand, sort of the individualistic cultures, that's Anglo-Saxon, West European, American, and then you have the very collectivist cultures, which you have in China, in Southeast Asia, that you also have to a certain degree in Indonesia, in Japan, etc. If I look at Russia today, they're a little bit in between. Just like the Middle East is a little bit in between. So on one hand, you can say, well, they're closer to the Western values than to the sort of, really, Asian values. But on the other hand, they have to decide where to go. And because they're a little bit in between, that might create periods of instability, which is exactly what you're seeing in the Middle East right now. Now, that doesn't mean there will necessarily be instability, but that can be a problem. So you can be both optimistic in the long run, but at the same time realizing that there could be problems. So coming back to Russia, I am quite critical of Putin, but I also realize that there could be scenarios where much more authoritarian leaders come to power, and that's not something that can be excluded. So there could be, I can imagine some Maidan scenario for Russia, but I can also imagine something much worse than what there is right now.
Okay, we have time for just one question, please.
Thank you. First of all, thank you a lot for your lecture. And so first of all, thank you a lot for your lecture. And my question is, there was a Soviet academician economist, Yuri Vasilievich Yeremenko, who in the very beginning of 90s bring his explanation of different results of transition of Soviet and Chinese economy. And his explanation of political background was relatively close to yours. But in addition, he says that due to the imbalanced character of common economy in the beginning of transition, the speed of reform itself was a factor that was very vital for the results. So he said that China just had enough time to gradually improve these imbalances, and that was one of the explanations why they didn't have such a huge drop down as in Russia. So if you know his works, what do you think of it? And if not, because I'm not sure that it has been translated to foreign languages, what do you think of the factor of the speed of reforms in the question? How the speed itself influence the success of reforms? Thank you.
Yes. So I'm not aware of this, so maybe if you can give me the reference. I read Russian, so I could certainly read. As you probably know, 25 years ago, there were lots of debates about how fast the reform should go. Should you go very fast or should you go more slowly? I have been on record as arguing more for a gradual change. My main reason was more to create momentum. That I was afraid that, very speedy transformation could lead to some collapse, and this collapse would lead to some backlash. People said, oh, this backlash never happened. And I say, oh, sorry, it's happening right now. It's happening right now. Look at how people react about, what happened in the 90s, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I think, part of my talk is that, the speed was not that important relative to what we thought. The speed, for some reason, this was the major, people want to go fast, people want to go slowly. And actually, people who wanted more reforms usually wanted to go faster. And then people who said they wanted to go slower, they wanted less reform. So there was a lot of confusion. But in the end, I don't think this factor was fundamental. If I look at, if I compare, let's say, Poland to Russia, speed was probably the same, and still outcomes were quite different. So I'm not clear, but probably I think that there is an element of allocative changes that need to take place. But maybe I should read that argument. But anyway, I'm giving you my reaction.
Time is over, so let me say many thanks to Gérard for the brilliant presentation and the possibility to discuss important issues. Thank you very much.